They laughed when I showed up to the family barbecue in my uniform, calling it a costume for playing soldier. My cousin Jake snorted and said I looked like I was heading to a Halloween party 6 months early. My sister rolled her eyes and muttered something about always having to make everything about myself. But when the Pentagon chief walked through our backyard gate 3 hours later and said your daughter saved lives, the laughter died in their throats. The paper plate of potato salad slipped from my aunt's hands and hit the concrete with a wet slap. The afternoon sun seemed to freeze in the sky as every conversation around the picnic tables fell silent. My father's beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips. My mother's mouth opened, but no words came out. Everything I had kept hidden for 2 years was about to spill into the open like water through a broken dam. The truth has a way of demanding its moment, and mine had finally arrived. Before I share what happened that day, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are watching from. I love hearing how far these stories reach and knowing we are connected across the miles. The thing about being the family disappointment is that after a while, you stop trying to prove them wrong. You just accept that your sister will always be the successful lawyer, your brother will always be the star athlete turned business owner, and you will always be the one who couldn't quite figure life out. At least that is what they believed about me. Sarah the Wanderer. Sarah the Dreamer. Sarah who joined the military because she had no other options. Sarah who sits behind a desk somewhere doing paperwork while real soldiers fight real wars. That is the story they told themselves about my life, and I let them believe it because the truth was classified at a level they could never understand. Growing up in our house meant living in the shadow of achievement. My sister Emma graduated valedictorian, earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law, and had her first case featured on the evening news before she turned 28. My brother Marcus lettered in 3 sports, married his high school sweetheart, and built a construction company that employed half our hometown. Then there was me, the middle child who read too many books, asked too many questions, and never seemed to excel at anything that mattered to my parents. I was the one they worried about during their late-night conversations in the kitchen. I was the one they made excuses for at church gatherings and family reunions. When I announced my decision to join the Army after high school, the disappointment in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. My father set down his coffee cup and shook his head like I had just told him I was running away to join the circus. My mother burst into tears and asked where she had gone wrong as a parent. Emma looked up from her law school applications long enough to suggest I was just afraid of real responsibility. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder and said it was probably for the best since I never had much direction anyway. None of them understood that I had been planning this moment for years, that I had already scored in the top 5% on my ASVAB, that recruiters from 3 different branches had been calling our house. The day I left for basic training, my mother cried like she was sending me to my funeral. My father shook my hand with the same resigned expression he wore when our old dog had to be put down. Emma gave me a quick hug and told me to be safe, as if I were heading off to summer camp instead of beginning a military career. Marcus loaded my single duffel bag into his truck and spent the entire drive to the airport explaining why the military was really just welfare for people who could not make it in the real world. I sat in the passenger seat listening to him tear down the very thing I was about to dedicate my life to, knowing that someday I would prove him wrong in ways he could never imagine. Basic training was everything I expected and nothing my family could have prepared me for. While they worried I would wash out in the first week, I excelled in ways that surprised even my drill sergeants. I scored expert on every weapon system they put in my hands. I finished first in my class in tactical operations. I earned the respect of soldiers who had initially dismissed me as another soft civilian playing dress-up. But when I called home each week, the conversations always steered toward when I was coming back to real life, when I was going to grow out of this phase and do something meaningful with my future. The letters from home painted a picture of a family moving on without me. Emma passed the bar exam and joined a prestigious firm in the state capital. Marcus expanded his business and bought a house on the hill overlooking downtown. My parents bragged about their successful children to anyone who would listen, and I began to notice how rarely my name came up in their stories. When I did get mentioned, it was always with a qualifier. Sarah is in the Army now, they would say, but she will figure out what she really wants to do eventually. Sarah is stationed in Texas, they would explain, doing some kind of computer work we do not really understand. After basic training, my test scores and aptitude evaluations caught the attention of people whose names I still cannot mention in public. I was selected for advanced intelligence training at a facility that does not appear on any public maps. For 6 months, I learned skills that would have amazed and terrified my family in equal measure. I studied languages most people have never heard of. I memorized the faces and habits of individuals whose capture could shift the balance of power in entire regions. I trained with technology that existed years before it would ever reach civilian markets. I became someone my family would not have recognized, someone they never could have imagined I was capable of becoming. My first deployment took me to places I cannot name to do work I cannot describe in detail. What I can tell you is that the skills I learned in that classified facility saved lives in ways that mattered. The intelligence I gathered prevented attacks that would have made international headlines. The reports I filed reached desks in the Pentagon and influenced decisions that affected the safety of thousands of American soldiers deployed around the world. I was not sitting behind a desk filing paperwork. I was not playing soldier in some safe rear area far from danger. I was doing work that mattered on a level my family could never comprehend because they were not cleared to know it existed. But when I called home from secure phone lines whose locations I could not reveal, the conversations always felt like talking to people who lived in a different universe. My mother would ask if I was eating enough vegetables. My father would wonder when I was going to use my GI Bill to go back to school for something practical. Emma would share stories about her latest court victories and suggest I might want to consider law enforcement when I got out of the service, since I already had some military experience. Marcus would update me on his business success and remind me that there was always a place for me in construction if I ever wanted real work that paid decent money. They meant well, but their words cut deeper than they knew. Here I was, carrying secrets that could not be shared, doing work that literally kept people alive, serving my country in ways that most civilians would never understand, and my own family saw me as the lost child who had not yet found her way in the world. They measured success in dollars earned and titles achieved and trophies displayed on office walls. They had no framework for understanding the kind of success that comes with security clearances and commendations that never see the light of day. The disconnect between my two worlds became more painful with each visit home. I would sit at family dinners listening to Emma describe her latest legal triumph while I remained silent about operations that would never make the news. I would watch Marcus show off his new truck while thinking about the specialized equipment I had been trained to operate that cost more than his entire business. I would smile and nod when my parents asked about my job, giving them vague answers about administrative duties and computer systems because the truth was classified at levels they did not even know existed. My second deployment was even more intense than the first. The work I did during those months changed the trajectory of conflicts that most Americans never knew were happening. I worked alongside people whose names you would recognize if I could tell you who they were. I briefed officials whose decisions shaped foreign policy for years to come. I received commendations from commanders whose approval meant more to me than any civilian award ever could. But when I returned home for Christmas leave, the conversations around our dinner table made it clear that my family still saw me as the aimless daughter who had joined the military because she had no better options. The breaking point came during Emma's engagement party the following spring. I had flown home on emergency leave, still wearing my dress uniform because I had come straight from a ceremony I could not discuss. The whole family was there, along with Emma's new in-laws and dozens of family friends I had grown up knowing. As the evening wore on and the champagne flowed, the conversation inevitably turned to what everyone was doing with their lives. Emma glowed as she described her promotion to senior associate. Marcus announced his company had won the contract to build the new courthouse downtown. My parents beamed with pride as their friends congratulated them on raising such successful children. Then someone asked about me, and the mood shifted in a way that made my chest tight. My mother smiled, that careful smile she reserved for uncomfortable topics, and explained that I was still in the army, still trying to figure out my next step in life. My father added that the military was good for teaching discipline, but eventually I would need to transition to something more stable and long-term. Emma jumped in to say she had been researching programs that help veterans go back to school, as if I were some charity case in need of rescue rather than a highly trained professional serving her country. The conversation that followed felt like being slowly suffocated. Person after person offered advice on what I should do with my life, as if my current life were somehow temporary or insufficient. They suggested careers in law enforcement, government administration, private security, anything that would translate my military experience into something they could understand and approve of. Through it all, I stood there in my dress uniform with ribbons and badges that represented achievements they could never comprehend, feeling smaller and more invisible with each passing minute. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by participation trophies and high school photos, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being underestimated. I was tired of being seen as the family member who had not quite figured life out. I was tired of carrying secrets that made me feel isolated from the people I loved most. I decided that the next time I came home, I would wear my uniform with pride regardless of their reactions. I would stop apologizing for choosing service over the kind of success they could understand. I would stop shrinking myself to fit into their narrow definition of achievement. The invitation to this year's family barbecue arrived with a handwritten note from my mother asking me to please dress casually and try to just relax and have fun for once. The message was clear even though she had not said it directly. Do not make this about your military thing. Do not wear that uniform that makes everyone uncomfortable. Just be normal Sarah for one afternoon. But I was done being normal Sarah, the disappointment daughter who apologized for her choices. I was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, holder of security clearances that took years to earn, recipient of commendations that would never be publicly acknowledged, veteran of operations that literally saved lives. I pressed my dress uniform with extra care that morning. I polished every button and badge until they gleamed in the sunlight streaming through my apartment window. I checked every ribbon and medal to make sure they were positioned exactly according to regulations. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror and saw not the lost girl my family remembered, but the professional soldier I had become through years of training, service, and sacrifice they would never know about. I was finally ready to stop hiding who I really was, even if they were not ready to see it. The drive to my parents' house took 45 minutes through countryside that had not changed much since my childhood. I passed the high school where Emma had been valedictorian and Marcus had been homecoming king. I drove by the community college where my parents had always assumed I would end up before I surprised them by choosing the military instead. I turned onto the familiar street lined with houses where I had grown up feeling like I never quite measured up to the expectations that seemed to come so naturally to my siblings. But today felt different. Today I was not coming home as the family disappointment hoping for acceptance. Today I was coming home as myself, uniform and all. The backyard was already full of people when I arrived. Aunts and uncles, cousins and family friends, neighbors who had known me since I was in diapers. I could see Emma holding court near the picnic tables, probably telling stories about her latest courtroom victory. Marcus was manning the grill, beer in one hand and spatula in the other, surrounded by men who wanted to hear about his business success. My parents were making their rounds, playing the perfect hosts, making sure everyone had enough food and drink and conversation. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked through the back gate into a scene that would change everything. The first person to notice me was my cousin Jake, and his reaction set the tone for what followed. He pointed at my uniform and burst out laughing, loud enough that conversations around him stopped. "Look who decided to play dress-up today," he called out, drawing attention from every corner of the yard. My sister looked up from her conversation and rolled her eyes in that way that made me feel like I was 12 years old again. My mother hurried over with panic in her expression, asking why I had not changed into normal clothes like she had asked. The next few minutes unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Comments flew from different directions about my choice to wear the uniform to a casual family gathering. Someone joked that I must be expecting a parade in my honor. Another person asked if there was some kind of costume contest they had not heard about. Marcus abandoned his post at the grill long enough to suggest I was always trying to make everything about myself. Emma made some cutting remark about not being able to let go of the military identity long enough to just be family. I stood there absorbing their reactions like arrows to the chest, each comment confirming what I had always suspected they really thought about my service. To them, my uniform was a costume, my rank was meaningless, my years of dedicated service were just an extended phase I needed to grow out of. They saw me as a woman playing soldier rather than a soldier who happened to be their daughter and sister. The gap between who I really was and who they thought I was had never felt wider or more painful. But I held my ground because something inside me had shifted. I was done apologizing for being proud of my service. I was done pretending my work did not matter just to make family gatherings more comfortable. I was done being ashamed of achievements they could not understand simply because they were classified. For the first time in years, I felt completely clear about who I was and what I had accomplished, regardless of whether my family could see it or appreciate it. The afternoon stretched ahead of us, filled with the usual barbecue activities and family dynamics that had not changed in decades. I helped carry food from the kitchen to the picnic tables, made small talk with relatives I saw once a year, and tried to find my place in conversations that seemed to flow around me rather than include me. But something was different this time. I was not trying to prove anything or win anyone's approval. I was simply existing as myself, uniform and all, letting them react however they chose to react. As the sun climbed higher and the backyard filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, I had no idea that everything was about to change. I had no way of knowing that a phone call was being made at that very moment, that official vehicles were being dispatched, that a man whose name I had only heard spoken in the most secure briefing rooms was about to walk into our suburban backyard. I was focused on surviving another family gathering where I felt like an outsider in my own family, never imagining that vindication was already on its way to find me. What my family did not know as they laughed at my uniform that afternoon was that 18 months earlier, I had been sitting in a windowless room 3 levels below the Pentagon, briefing a joint task force on intelligence that would reshape American operations in 2 different theaters. The room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, and the faces around the conference table belonged to people whose decisions affected the lives of thousands of soldiers deployed around the world. I was 26 years old, the youngest person in that room by at least 15 years, and I was about to deliver information that would save more lives than my family could ever imagine. The operation had started 6 months before that briefing, in a place I still cannot name, doing work that remains classified at levels most people do not even know exist. What I can tell you is that I had been tracking communications patterns that revealed something enormous, something that would have resulted in coordinated attacks on American forces if we had not acted on the intelligence I had gathered. For weeks, I worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in a room next to the operations center, living on energy bars and determination while I pieced together a puzzle that most analysts would have missed entirely. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday that felt like it had lasted forever. I was staring at data streams that had been running for hours when I saw the pattern that everyone else had overlooked. It was subtle, buried in routine communications that appeared completely innocent on the surface, but when viewed through the lens of everything else I had been tracking, it revealed a coordinated effort that would have been devastating if executed successfully. My hands were shaking as I reached for the secure phone to make the calls that would set everything in motion. Within hours, teams were being deployed to locations I had identified through careful analysis of seemingly unrelated intelligence fragments. The operation that followed was swift, precise, and completely invisible to the outside world. No news cameras recorded what happened. No reporters wrote stories about the attacks that never occurred. No families received visits from casualty notification officers because the soldiers who would have been targeted were safely relocated based on intelligence I had provided. The success was measured not in headlines or public recognition, but in lives that continued, families that remained whole, missions that proceeded without catastrophe. The commendation ceremony that followed took place in a secure facility that does not appear on any public maps. The general who pinned the medal to my chest told me that my work had prevented what could have been the deadliest coordinated attack on American forces in over a decade. The citation read aloud that day mentioned my exceptional analytical skills, my dedication to duty, and my direct contribution to saving the lives of American service members. But the details of what I had actually done, the specifics of how I had uncovered the threat, the names of the soldiers whose lives I had helped save, all of that remained classified at levels that would keep the truth hidden for decades. That medal now sits in a safety deposit box in a bank 40 miles from my parents' house, along with 2 others I have earned for work I can never fully describe. The ribbons on my uniform represent achievements that most civilians would consider extraordinary, but to my family, they are just colorful pieces of fabric that confirm their belief that I am playing dress-up soldier. They have no way of knowing that the Defense Intelligence Agency has a file with my name on it that contains performance evaluations using words like exceptional, invaluable, and mission-critical. They cannot comprehend that my security clearance took 2 years to obtain and requires annual polygraph examinations to maintain. The second major operation I was involved in took place 8 months after the first, in a different part of the world under circumstances I still cannot discuss in detail. What I can share is that it involved a hostage situation that had been developing for weeks, American civilians trapped in a location where traditional rescue operations would have been impossible. The intelligence I gathered through methods I learned in training programs my family has never heard of provided the key information that made their safe extraction possible. I spent 72 consecutive hours in an operations center, coordinating with assets whose existence is not publicly acknowledged, tracking movements and communications that led to a successful resolution. The after-action report from that operation, classified at levels that ensure it will never see daylight, described my contributions as instrumental to the success of the mission. The civilians who were rescued never knew my name and never will, but they went home to their families because of work I did in rooms they will never see using skills they could never imagine. The operation made no news because the best intelligence work is invisible, successful precisely because no one knows it happened. But the knowledge that those people are alive today because of analysis I provided, decisions I informed, coordinates I calculated, that knowledge sustains me in ways my family could never understand. Between deployments, I trained other soldiers and techniques I had developed through trial and error in real-world situations. The courses I taught at facilities whose names I cannot mention prepared intelligence analysts for the kind of work that keeps American forces safe around the world. Students who learned from my experience went on to their own deployments, their own operations, their own successes that would never be publicly acknowledged. The impact of what I had learned and shared rippled outward in ways that multiplied the effect of my service beyond anything I could measure or quantify. The phone calls home during this period were exercises in creative omission. When my mother asked what I had been doing at work, I would mention training exercises and computer systems analysis. When my father wondered if I was learning anything useful, I would talk about leadership development and professional education opportunities. When Emma inquired about my day-to-day responsibilities, I would describe administrative duties and routine operational support. None of it was technically a lie, but none of it conveyed the reality of work that had direct impact on national security and soldier safety. The hardest part was not the secrecy itself, but the way that secrecy made me invisible to the people I loved most. I could not share the pride I felt when a senior intelligence officer told me my work was the best he had seen in 20 years of service. I could not explain the satisfaction that came from knowing that families somewhere were intact because of threats I had identified and neutralized. I could not describe the weight of responsibility that came with handling information that could shift the balance of power in entire regions if it fell into the wrong hands. All of that had to remain locked inside me, creating a distance from my family that grew wider with each conversation. The recognition I received within the intelligence community only highlighted how little recognition I could expect outside of it. Colleagues who understood the significance of my contributions treated me with respect that bordered on reverence. Senior officers sought my input on operations that would never be declassified. My name appeared on distribution lists for briefings that reached the highest levels of government. But to my family, I was still Sarah, the lost daughter who had joined the military because she could not figure out what else to do with her life. The contrast became almost surreal during my visits home. I would sit at family dinners listening to Emma describe winning cases that made local headlines while I remained silent about operations that affected international relations. I would watch Marcus show off awards from the Chamber of Commerce while thinking about commendations locked in security vaults that recognized achievements far beyond anything he could imagine. I would smile politely when relatives asked if I had learned any marketable skills in the Army, knowing that my actual skills were so specialized and classified that most civilian employers would never even know they existed. My third deployment was the most intense yet, involving work I absolutely cannot discuss even in general terms. What I can say is that it lasted 14 months, took me to locations that required diplomatic clearances just to enter, and resulted in intelligence products that were briefed directly to cabinet-level officials. The work I did during those months influenced policy decisions that shaped American strategic operations for years to come. I worked alongside people whose names appear in history books, contributed to successes that will never be publicly acknowledged, and earned recognition from individuals whose approval represents the highest honor my profession can offer. The stress of that deployment was unlike anything I had experienced before. There were weeks when I slept 3 hours a night, sustained by nothing but coffee and the knowledge that lives depended on the accuracy of my analysis. There were days when the weight of classified information felt like it might crush me, when the responsibility of knowing things that could not be shared felt heavier than I could bear. There were moments when I questioned whether the sacrifice of living a divided life, of being unable to share my real achievements with the people I loved, was worth the contribution I was making to something larger than myself. But then I would receive reports about operations that succeeded because of intelligence I had provided, or briefings about threats that were neutralized because of patterns I had identified, or updates about soldiers who came home safely because of recommendations I had made, and I knew that the sacrifice was not only worth it but necessary. The work I was doing mattered in ways that transcended personal recognition or family approval. I was serving something larger than myself, contributing to the safety and security of people who would never know my name, but whose lives were better because of what I did in rooms they would never see. The medals and commendations accumulated during this period filled a second safety deposit box, along with letters of appreciation from officials whose signatures alone would have impressed my family if they could have seen them. But these achievements existed in a parallel universe from the life my family knew about, creating a gap between my public and private identities that sometimes felt like it might tear me apart. I was simultaneously one of the most accomplished people in my extended family, and the one they worried about most, the most professionally successful, and the one they considered least settled in life. The psychological toll of living this double existence became harder to bear with each visit home. I would arrive for holidays and family gatherings carrying secrets that weighed on me like physical burdens, knowing that I could never fully explain who I had become or what I had accomplished during the months since I had seen them last. The conversations always felt hollow because they were based on incomplete information, relationships built on a version of me that was real but not complete, love offered to someone they knew but did not fully understand. The turning point came during my most recent deployment, an assignment that pushed me to the absolute limits of my abilities and training. I was selected for a joint operation involving multiple intelligence agencies, working directly with assets whose existence was known only to a handful of people in the entire government. The mission lasted 6 months and required me to coordinate intelligence gathering efforts across multiple time zones and jurisdictions, synthesizing information from sources that ranged from technical surveillance to human intelligence to signals analysis. The operation was a complete success, resulting in the disruption of networks that had been operating undetected for years. The intelligence we gathered led to arrests that made international headlines, though my role in providing the key analytical breakthrough was never mentioned in any public reporting. The after-action briefing I delivered to a room full of senior officials from multiple agencies was described by one participant as the most comprehensive and insightful analysis he had encountered in 30 years of intelligence work. The commendation I received for that operation was signed by people whose names my family would recognize if they saw them on the evening news. The citation described my work as having strategic impact on national security interests, language that understated the reality of what had been accomplished through months of exhausting, meticulous, invisible work. But like all my other achievements, this one went into a safety deposit box rather than onto a wall where my family could see it, another secret success in a career built on accomplishments that could never be shared. As I sat in my parents' backyard that afternoon, enduring their reactions to my uniform and their commentary about my life choices, all of this history was running through my mind like a movie reel. Every joke about playing dress-up reminded me of briefings I had given to rooms full of generals. Every suggestion that I needed to find real work reminded me of operations that had succeeded because of analysis I had provided. Every expression of concern about my future reminded me of commendations locked away in bank vaults, recognition that proved my value to people who understood the work I did. The irony was almost unbearable. Here I was, surrounded by family members who measured success in terms they could understand and display, while my actual achievements remained hidden in classified files and secure facilities. They were worried about my lack of direction while I was being recruited for assignments that came with security clearances most people did not even know existed. They were concerned about my ability to contribute to society while I was already contributing in ways that literally kept society safe. But I had made peace with the contradiction because I understood something they could not. Real achievement does not always come with public recognition. The most important work is often the work that no one sees, the contributions that matter precisely because they remain invisible. I had chosen a path that required sacrificing personal credit for public service, trading family understanding for national security, accepting that my greatest accomplishments would always be secrets I carried alone. As the afternoon wore on and the conversations flowed around me, I found myself thinking about all the soldiers who were alive today because of intelligence I had provided, all the operations that had succeeded because of analysis I had contributed, all the threats that had been neutralized because of patterns I had identified. Those soldiers would never know my name, but they were home with their families because of work I had done in rooms my own family would never see. That knowledge had to be enough, because it was all I would ever have. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when I noticed my father checking his phone with an expression I had never seen before. He stepped away from the group gathered around the grill, walking toward the house with the phone pressed to his ear. My mother noticed too, following him with questions that he waved away with an urgency that seemed out of place at a casual family gathering. Something was happening, something that had nothing to do with barbecue logistics or family coordination. Within minutes, my father was back, but his demeanor had completely changed. He looked around the backyard with an expression that combined confusion and concern, his eyes finally settling on me with a look I could not interpret. He approached my mother and spoke to her in a low voice that carried just far enough for me to catch fragments about official visits and security protocols and people who needed to speak with me immediately. The casual atmosphere of the afternoon was about to change in ways none of us could have anticipated. My mother's face went pale as she listened to whatever my father was telling her. Emma and Marcus noticed the shift and moved closer, trying to understand why their parents suddenly looked like they had received devastating news. The extended family and friends continued their conversations, unaware that something was happening that would transform our gathering from a routine barbecue into something none of us would ever forget. I felt my own phone vibrating in my pocket, the special ringtone that indicated a call from a number I had been instructed to answer immediately regardless of circumstances. The tone cut through the afternoon air like a knife, commanding attention in a way that made several people turn to look at me. As I reached for the phone, I realized that my two worlds were about to collide in the most public way possible, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The voice on the other end of the line was crisp, professional, and completely familiar from dozens of secure briefings over the past 3 years. The message was brief and non-negotiable. Official visitors were en route to my location. I was to remain available and await their arrival. No further information would be provided over an unsecured line. The call ended before I could ask any questions, leaving me standing in my parents' backyard holding a silent phone while my family stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. As I put the phone back in my pocket, I realized that the afternoon I had planned to endure was about to become something entirely different. The truth I had been carrying in secret for years was about to emerge whether I was ready for it or not. The gap between who my family thought I was and who I really had become was about to be bridged by people whose arrival would change everything forever. The black SUVs appeared at the end of our street exactly 12 minutes after the phone call ended, their tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. I watched from the backyard as they moved in perfect formation down the suburban road where I had learned to ride a bicycle 20 years earlier, their presence so out of place in our quiet neighborhood that several neighbors stepped onto their porches to stare. The vehicles moved with the kind of precision that only comes from official government operations, and I knew without being told that my carefully constructed separation between my military life and my family life was about to end permanently. My father was the first to spot the convoy, his beer bottle frozen halfway to his lips as he watched 3 identical vehicles turn into our driveway with mechanical precision. My mother grabbed his arm with both hands, her knuckles white against his shirt sleeve, her voice barely a whisper as she asked what was happening and why official-looking cars were parking in front of their house. Emma abandoned her conversation mid-sentence and moved toward the back door, her lawyer instincts clearly telling her that whatever was unfolding was significant beyond anything she had experienced in her legal career. Marcus turned off the grill without being asked, the sizzling of forgotten hamburgers falling silent as every person in the backyard focused their attention on the driveway where car doors were opening with crisp, military efficiency. The sound of polished shoes on concrete carried across the yard like gunshots, each footstep measured and deliberate in a way that made the casual atmosphere of our family gathering seem suddenly inappropriate and fragile. The first person through the back gate was a young lieutenant whose uniform was so perfectly pressed it looked like it had been ironed while he was wearing it. He moved with the kind of bearing that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and what you are supposed to do, his eyes scanning the assembled family members with professional assessment before settling on me with unmistakable recognition. Behind him came 2 more officers whose rank insignia caught the sunlight and threw it back like small explosions of authority and purpose. But it was the 4th person through the gate who made my mother gasp out loud and caused my father to set down his beer so quickly it nearly fell over. General Patricia Hawkins, Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, walked into our suburban backyard wearing a dress uniform that made my own ribbons and badges look modest by comparison. I had seen her photograph in briefing materials and secure facilities, but I had never been in the same room with her, never imagined that someone of her stature would ever have reason to know my name or visit my family. The general's presence transformed our casual gathering into something that felt like a formal military ceremony. Conversations died in mid-sentence as she moved across the grass with the kind of confidence that comes from commanding respect in the most powerful rooms in the world. Her ribbons told stories of deployments and achievements that spanned decades of service, and the stars on her shoulders caught the light in a way that seemed to announce her authority to anyone within sight. She stopped directly in front of me and rendered a salute that was returned with precision I had not used since my last formal inspection. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away, the sound echoing across a backyard where 25 people stood frozen in a moment that none of them understood, but all of them recognized as significant beyond their comprehension. General Hawkins spoke in a voice that carried the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of lives. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," she said, using my rank in a way that made several family members look at each other with expressions of confusion and dawning realization. "I am here today to personally thank you for exceptional service that has brought great credit to yourself, your unit, and the United States Army. Your analytical work during Operation Silent Shield directly resulted in the prevention of coordinated attacks that would have cost American lives and compromised national security interests." The words hung in the afternoon air like a revelation that changed the molecular structure of everything around us. My cousin Jake, who had been making jokes about my uniform 3 hours earlier, stared at the general with his mouth slightly open, trying to process what he was hearing. My sister Emma, who had suggested I needed to find real work that paid decent money, stood perfectly still as if movement might shatter whatever was happening in front of her. The general continued speaking, her voice carrying across the yard with military precision and unmistakable sincerity. The intelligence you provided during the 14-month operation led to the disruption of networks that had been operating undetected for over 3 years. Your work resulted in the arrest of individuals whose activities pose direct threats to American forces deployed in 2 different theaters of operation. The lives saved through your dedicated analysis cannot be quantified, but the impact of your service will be felt for years to come. My father's face had gone completely white, the casual confidence he had worn all afternoon replaced by an expression of shock and something that looked like the beginning of understanding. My mother was crying without making any sound, tears running down her cheeks as she stared at me like she was seeing a stranger wearing her daughter's face. Marcus had moved closer without realizing it, drawn by words he was hearing but still struggling to comprehend. General Hawkins reached into her jacket and withdrew a leather folder that she opened with ceremony appropriate to the moment. Staff Sergeant Martinez, by order of the Secretary of Defense and with the approval of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Defense Intelligence Agency Director's Award for Exceptional Service in support of national security operations. This commendation recognizes analytical excellence that directly contributed to the safety of American service members and the successful completion of classified operations vital to American strategic interests. The medal she pinned to my uniform was one I had only seen in photographs, awarded to fewer than 50 people in the history of the agency. The weight of it against my chest felt like vindication made manifest, public recognition of achievements that had existed in secret for years. But more than the medal itself, it was the presence of General Hawkins in my parents' backyard, the official acknowledgement of my service in front of family members who had dismissed it, that felt like a validation I had not even known I needed. As the general stepped back and rendered another crisp salute, the silence in the backyard stretched on until it felt like it might become permanent. My aunt, who had dropped her potato salad when the general first appeared, still had not moved to clean it up. My uncle, who had been telling stories about his successful insurance business, looked like he had forgotten how to speak. Emma's future in-laws, who had been introduced to me as Sarah, the one who joined the military, stared at me with expressions that suggested they were recalculating everything they thought they knew. The general turned to address my parents directly, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, you have raised a daughter whose service to this country exemplifies the highest ideals of military excellence and personal sacrifice. The work she has done over the past 3 years has been instrumental in protecting American lives and advancing American interests around the world. Her dedication, skill, and integrity have earned the respect and admiration of senior officials throughout the intelligence community. My mother was openly crying now, her hands pressed to her mouth as if she could hold back words that wanted to spill out. My father stood perfectly still, his eyes moving back and forth between the general and me as if he were trying to understand how these 2 versions of reality could exist simultaneously. The daughter he thought he knew and the soldier being honored by a 3-star general seemed like different people, and I could see him struggling to reconcile them into a single identity. The general's final words carried the weight of official recognition that could never be taken back or diminished. The men and women under my command speak of Staff Sergeant Martinez with the kind of respect reserved for the most exceptional soldiers. Her contributions to recent operations have been described by senior analysts as mission-critical and strategically invaluable. The intelligence community is fortunate to have someone of her caliber, and the American people are safer because of her service. When the ceremony concluded and the general shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who understood exactly what my service had cost and accomplished, the backyard began to return to something resembling normal activity. But normal had been redefined in ways that would never be undone. The conversations that resumed were different, the way people looked at me had changed, and the dynamics that had shaped my family relationships for 26 years had been permanently altered by 15 minutes of official recognition. The general and her entourage departed as efficiently as they had arrived, leaving behind a family gathering that had been transformed into something none of us had words to describe. As the sound of their vehicles faded into the distance, I found myself standing in the same backyard where I had been mocked for wearing my uniform, but everything felt different in ways that went beyond surface recognition or momentary validation. My father was the first to approach me, his steps hesitant as if he were not sure he had permission to come closer. When he reached me, he looked at my uniform with new eyes, seeing the ribbons and badges not as meaningless decorations, but as symbols of achievements he was finally beginning to understand. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard before, "I had no idea. We had no idea what you were doing, what you had accomplished, what you meant to all of this." Emma was crying when she hugged me, her tears soaking into the fabric of my uniform as she whispered apologies for every dismissive comment she had ever made about my service. "I am so sorry," she repeated over and over, her voice breaking with each word. "I am so sorry I did not understand. I am so sorry I made you feel like what you were doing did not matter. I am so proud of you, and I should have been proud all along." Marcus stood nearby, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like humility mixed with regret. The brother who had spent years explaining why the military was just welfare for people who could not make it in the real world was seeing his sister receive recognition from one of the most senior officials in the defense establishment. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly as if he were testing each one before letting it out. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. About what you were doing. About what it meant, about who you are." The extended family and friends who had witnessed the ceremony approached with expressions ranging from awe to embarrassment to newfound respect. Conversations that had felt hollow and dismissive 3 hours earlier were replaced by questions that showed genuine interest in understanding what they had just witnessed. People who had offered career advice based on the assumption that I needed to transition to real work were now asking about my experiences with the kind of curiosity that comes from recognizing they had been talking to someone whose life was far more significant than they had imagined. But the most meaningful change was not in how others saw me, but in how I felt standing among them. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was hiding part of myself or apologizing for choices that made others uncomfortable. The uniform I wore was not a costume or a symbol of failure to launch into adult life, but a representation of service that had been officially recognized as valuable and important. The gap between my public and private identities had been bridged in the most public way possible. My mother spent the rest of the afternoon asking questions she had never thought to ask before, wanting to understand what my deployments had really involved and what my work actually meant. I could not answer most of her questions due to classification levels that would never be lowered, but I could see her trying to piece together a new understanding of the daughter she thought she knew. The worry that had characterized her attitude toward my military service was being replaced by something that looked like pride mixed with amazement. As the afternoon shifted toward evening and the barbecue resumed with a subdued energy that reflected how much had changed, I found myself feeling something I had not experienced in years. I felt seen by my family in a way that went beyond surface recognition or momentary attention. They were seeing not just the uniform or the medals or the official validation, but the person who had earned them through years of service they were finally beginning to understand mattered. The conversations that continued through dinner were different in ways that would have been impossible to imagine that morning. Instead of suggestions about what I should do with my life, there were questions about what my work involved and expressions of admiration for achievements they were only beginning to comprehend. Instead of concern about my lack of direction, there was recognition that I had found a path that utilized skills and dedication they had not even known I possessed. When it came time to leave, the goodbyes carried a weight they had never held before. My father shook my hand with the kind of respect he usually reserved for people he considered successful in ways he could understand and measure. My mother hugged me with a fierceness that felt like she was trying to make up for years of not fully appreciating what I was doing with my life. Emma and Marcus both asked when they could see me again, their interest genuine rather than obligatory. As I drove home that evening, Still wearing the uniform that had been the subject of so much commentary earlier in the day, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal vindication or family recognition. The work I had been doing in secret for years had been acknowledged in the most public way possible, creating a bridge between my service identity and my family identity that I had not even realized I needed. The medal on my chest would join the others in a safety deposit box, hidden away like all the recognition I had received for work that remained classified. But the knowledge that my family had seen me receive it, had heard an official explanation of what my service meant, had been forced to confront the gap between their perceptions and reality. That knowledge would stay with me in a way that no private commendation ever could. The phone calls that followed in the weeks after the barbecue were different from any conversations I had had with family members in years. They asked about my work with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. They shared my story with friends and extended family members with obvious pride rather than worried explanations. They began to understand that the daughter and sister they had been concerned about was actually exceeding every expectation they had ever held, just in ways they had not been equipped to see or measure. The change in family dynamics was not dramatic or sudden, but it was permanent in ways that mattered more than any temporary shift in attitude. I was no longer the family member they worried about or the one who needed guidance about finding her way in the world. I was someone whose choices had been validated at the highest levels, whose service had been recognized as meaningful and important, whose path through life was finally visible to people who loved me but had not understood me. The uniform hanging in my closet at home now represented something different than it had that morning. It was no longer a symbol of the gap between who I was and who my family thought I was, but a bridge that connected my two identities in ways that felt sustainable and authentic. I could wear it with pride not just because of what it meant to me, but because of what my family now understood it represented. Looking back on that afternoon, I realized that the vindication I experienced was not really about proving my family wrong or demonstrating that their perceptions had been inaccurate. It was about creating space for my whole self to exist in relationship with people I loved, about bridging the gap between service and family that had felt unbridgeable for so long. The recognition that mattered most was not the official commendation from the general, but the moment when my parents and siblings saw me clearly for the first time in years. The work I do continues to be classified at levels that prevent me from sharing most of what I accomplish with anyone outside the intelligence community. The operations I support and the analysis I provide remain invisible to the public and largely unknown to my family. But the foundation of understanding that was created that afternoon provides a context for our relationship that allows me to be proud of my service without having to explain every detail or justify every choice. Sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones, the moments when truth emerges not through argument or explanation, but through undeniable evidence that speaks for itself. That afternoon in my parents' backyard, surrounded by family members who had spent years misunderstanding my choices, I learned that vindication does not require revenge or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it just requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to let your work speak for itself when the time is right. The medal in my safety deposit box is joined now by a photo from that afternoon, a picture my mother took of me standing with General Hawkins in our suburban backyard. In the background, you can see the picnic tables and the grill and all the ordinary elements of a family gathering, but in the foreground is something extraordinary, a moment when two worlds collided and created something new and better than either had been alone. If you have found yourself in a place where the people you love do not fully understand the path you have chosen, where your achievements go unrecognized because they exist in spaces others cannot see, remember that truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. Your work matters even when it is invisible, your service has value even when it goes unacknowledged, and your worth is not diminished by other people's inability to see it clearly. The most meaningful recognition often comes not from strangers who understand your field, but from family members who finally see you for who you really are.